My name is Elena, 30 years old. For 4 years, my toxic sister-in-law, Chloe, treated me like a low-class outsider who married into her old money family for status. Backed by my husband, Chloe orchestrated a corporate coup during our annual family shareholder meeting, handing me a divorce decree and a termination letter simultaneously. She mocked me in front of the board, saying, "You're just a middle-class manager." My brother is taking the trillion-dollar eco-resort project, and you are leaving with nothing. I didn't cry. I signed the asset waiver, caught my husband's cold eyes, and walked out. Chloe popped champagne, completely unaware that the 600 acres of historical coastal land required to build that eco-resort didn't belong to the family corporation. It was owned entirely by my private environmental trust fund, which I bought before the marriage. 2 days later, construction was locked down by federal marshals, bankrupting their entire dynasty because they threw away the only woman who held the soil beneath their feet. The 75th floor boardroom of the Obsidian Tower in downtown Manhattan was an architectural testament to old money dominance. Floor-to-ceiling glass panels overlooked a rain-swept New York skyline, cutting through the dense gray mist of a chilly November afternoon. Inside, the long conference table, carved from a single piece of rare Indonesian petrified wood, was surrounded by the senior board members, institutional investors, and legal advisors of the Pendleton Development conglomerate. The atmosphere was sterile, quiet, and pulsing with a calculated, corporate hostility. Elena Pendleton sat near the lower end of the table, her posture perfectly straight, her hands clasped lightly over a sleek leather folder. At 30, she wore a sharp, unbranded charcoal wool blazer, her dark hair pulled back into a neat, professional low knot. For 4 years, Elena had served as the chief operating officer of the conglomerate's most ambitious venture, the Oasis Initiative, a projected trillion-dollar eco-resort development designed to capture the ultra-luxury sustainable tourism market. She had spent 14-hour days negotiating environmental permits, stabilizing supply chains, and transforming a chaotic, conceptual mess into the most valuable asset on the company's books. But to the people sitting at the head of the table, Elena was not a brilliant corporate strategist. She was an outsider, a middle-class scholarship student from upstate New York, who had dared to marry into one of the city's oldest real estate dynasties. "Let's bring this extraordinary session to order," Chloe Pendleton announced, her voice dripping with an abrasive, vocal-fried confidence that instantly silenced the room. Chloe, Elena's 26-year-old sister-in-law, sat languidly in her leather chair, her fingers draped in vintage diamonds as she adjusted a microphone. She had never spent a single night analyzing a corporate balance sheet or working on a construction site. Her only contribution to the family business was spending millions of dollars of the corporate marketing budget on international fashion shows and high society parties. Yet today, she sat directly beside her brother Elena's husband, Julian, flanked by a team of high-priced corporate litigation attorneys. Julian didn't look at Elena. He kept his eyes fixed strictly on his gold fountain pen, his expression a cold, detached mask of indifference. Over the past year, as the Oasis Initiative neared its final international funding phase, Julian's behavior had shifted from supportive partner to cold adversary, heavily influenced by Chloe's constant whispers that the Pendleton name shouldn't share its crown jewel project with a commoner. "We have reviewed the Q3 operational metrics for the Oasis Initiative," Chloe said, a smug, venomous smile spreading across her heavily contoured face, as she slid a thick legal document across the polished whooshed wood table toward Elena, "and the family council has reached a definitive decision. Effective immediately, Elena is removed from her position as chief operating officer due to a structural realignment of our executive board." A quiet, uncomfortable murmur rippled through the independent board members, but no one dared to speak up against the controlling shareholders. Elena's face remained entirely serene. She didn't flinch. She didn't let out a gasp of surprise. She simply looked down at the document, watching the light catch the bold lettering at the top of the page, Notice of Executive Termination and Marital Dissolution Waiver. A structural realignment, Chloe? Elena asked, her voice calm, level, and entirely devoid of fear. Or a coordinated corporate coup? Chloe let out a sharp, elitist laugh, leaning forward over the table with absolute disdain. Let's be entirely realistic for once in your life, Elena. You are a middle-class manager. You were a useful tool to handle the bureaucratic paperwork and deal with the local environmental agencies when we were launching the concept. But we are about to secure a multi-billion-dollar sovereign wealth fund investment from Dubai. A trillion-dollar eco-project requires an international icon to lead it, not a plain girl who buys her suits off the rack. Chloe reached over and tapped Julian's arm. My brother is taking over 100% of the operational control. Furthermore, since our family's prenuptial agreement strictly protects all historical shares and corporate assets under the Pendleton name, your marriage is officially dissolved. You are leaving this building with exactly what you brought into it, nothing. Julian finally raised his eyes, looking at Elena with a flat, transactional coldness that shattered the last remaining memory of the vows he had made to her. It's just business, Elena, he said smoothly, pushing the gold pen toward her. Chloe is right. Your background simply doesn't fit the elite global aesthetic we are projecting for the resort's future. Sign the asset waiver, accept the standard severance, and let's avoid an ugly public dispute. They waited. Chloe leaned back, her eyes shining with malicious triumph, waiting for Elena to cry, to scream about the 4 years of sleepless nights she had given to this company, or to beg Julian to remember their life together. Instead, Elena reached out, picked up the gold fountain pen, and turned directly to the final signature line. Her hand was perfectly steady as she signed her name with swift, elegant strokes. Vance. She used her maiden name, a detail the lawyers noticed but remained silent about. She capped the pen with a sharp click and stood up, smoothing the front of her blazer. The desk is clear, Julian, Elena said, looking directly at her husband, her dark eyes reflecting a cold, brilliant detachment. Enjoy your trillion-dollar project, Chloe. I hope the foundation is as stable as you think it is. Oh, it's perfectly stable, darling, Chloe mocked, popping open a bottle of champagne as the legal assistants collected the signed waivers. Now run along back to your middle-class reality. The elite are working. Elena turned and walked out of the boardroom, her footsteps echoing with a quiet, unshakable power against the marble floor. The heavy doors closed behind her, cutting off the sound of Chloe's laughter. As she stepped into the executive elevator, Elena pulled a private, encrypted smartphone from her handbag and dialed a direct line to the registrar of the Atlantic Coastal Land Trust. The call connected instantly. Good afternoon, Director Vance. We see the termination log on our system. Are we authorized to enforce the restriction? Elena looked at her reflection in the polished steel doors of the elevator. The domestic corporate mask she had worn to support her husband was officially gone, replaced by the calculating precision of a woman who had planned 3 steps ahead of her adversaries. Julian and Chloe truly believe the Pendleton conglomerate owns the project, Elena said, her voice dropping into a register of chilling authority. They have spent 4 years focusing on the architecture and the marketing, completely forgetting to check who actually owns the dirt beneath their feet. Execute the master land access revocation immediately. Lock down the site. While Chloe and Julian were busy pouring glasses of expensive crystal champagne in the high-floor boardroom of the Obsidian Tower, celebrating their successful corporate purge, Elena stood in the rain outside the building's massive granite lobby. The damp November air was freezing, but her expression remained remarkably calm. She climbed into the back seat of a waiting, matte black luxury SUV, where her private legal advisor, Marcus Vance, was already reviewing a set of digital property deeds on an encrypted tablet. They signed the executive termination without reviewing the auxiliary schedule, didn't they? Marcus asked, his tone dry and professional as the vehicle pulled away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the chaotic Manhattan traffic. Chloe was far too preoccupied with the diamond bracelets she bought using the company's marketing budget to read the fine print. Elena replied smoothly, taking off her damp trench coat and settling into the leather seat, and Julian simply trusted his sister's vanity. They genuinely believed that because the Pendleton name is on the architectural blueprints, they control the entire destiny of the Oasis Initiative. Marcus let out a quiet, cynical chuckle, his fingers tapping the tablet to send a secure file transfer to the Federal Land Management Registry. They are about to receive a massive lesson in real estate law. Your prenuptial agreement protected their historical stock shares, yes. But it did absolutely nothing to govern independent commercial acquisitions made by external private trusts. 4 years ago, before the Oasis Initiative was even a whisper in the ears of the Wall Street elite, Elena had been the one sent to the rugged coastline of Maine to scout the location for the project. The Pendleton family had assumed she was merely acting as a low-level corporate scout, filling out standard zoning paperwork. They didn't know that the 600 contiguous acres of pristine, deep-water coastal land, the absolute core site, upon which the entire trillion-dollar eco-resort was designed to sit, was owned by a reclusive, old-money agricultural family that refused to deal with high-profile corporate developers like the Pendletons. Elena hadn't used the Pendleton corporate treasury to buy that land. She had used her grandfather's private, quiet environmental conservation trust, the Vance Coastal Land Preservation Trust, to purchase the entire acreage under her maiden name for a fraction of its future value. She had then quietly leased the surface access rights to the Pendleton Development Conglomerate under a temporary, highly restrictive provisional land use permit that was legally contingent upon her remaining the active, presiding chief operating officer of the project. Julian and Chloe had spent the last 2 years pouring $300 million of investor capital into grading the soil, building luxury concrete foundations, and running deep-water utility lines directly onto that property. They thought they were building on their own family empire. In reality, they had been installing multi-million-dollar infrastructure on land that belonged entirely to the woman they had just thrown out of their boardroom. The digital land access revocation has been filed and time-stamped by the state registrar, Marcus announced, turning the tablet's screen toward Elena. A bright crimson banner blinked across the top of the official registry page. Property access category, restricted. External lease agreement terminated due to material breach of covenant. To material breach of covenant, exclusion order active. Elena looked at the blinking red text, her eyes steady, a cold, calculated detachment settling over her heart. They wanted a modern, high-profile icon to lead their project. Marcus, let's see how well their high-profile icon handles a nationwide federal construction injunction. Back in the executive suite of the Obsidian Tower, Julian was raising his champagne glass to the representative of the Dubai Sovereign Wealth Fund, completely blind to the fact that the automated legal system had just initiated a 72-hour countdown clock that would completely strip his family of the ground beneath their feet. The media pavilion at the edge of Central Park was a masterclass in high society spectacle. Less than 24 hours after the brutal boardroom coup at the Obsidian Tower, Chloe Pendleton had mobilized the family's entire PR apparatus to host an emergency global press launch. Giant holographic displays projected stunning, high-definition 3D renderings of the Oasis Initiative into the New York afternoon sky, showcasing overwater luxury villas, glass-domed eco-spas, and deep-water yacht slips. The air was filled with the scent of expensive floral arrangements, and waiters in tailored white tuxedos glided through the crowd of international journalists, luxury travel editors, and Wall Street real estate analysts. Chloe stood at the center of the media stage, wearing an asymmetrical cream designer dress that practically screamed corporate royalty. She beamed under the bright studio lights, flashing a wide, practiced smile for the flashing cameras. "Ladies and gentlemen of the global press," Chloe announced, her voice amplified by the state-of-the-art surround sound system. "Today we don't just announce a resort, we announce a sovereign-backed dynasty. The Pendleton Development Conglomerate, alongside our esteemed partners from the Dubai Sai Sovereign Wealth Fund, is officially breaking ground on a trillion-dollar era of sustainable luxury." The crowd erupted into enthusiastic applause. In the front row, representatives from the banking syndicates nodded in deep satisfaction, their eyes darting to the massive digital countdown clock on the side display that marked the official closing of the first $300 million institutional investment wire. Julian stood just behind his sister, looking sharp but slightly tightly wound in a new tailored suit. He stepped up to the microphone, adjusting his cuffs. "As the newly appointed Chief Executive Officer of the Oasis Initiative, I want to assure our investors that the transition of leadership has been entirely seamless. We have excised the low-level, bureaucratic bottlenecks that previously slowed our operational velocity. From this moment on, the Pendleton name controls 100% of this vision." Chloe leaned into Julian's shoulder, whispering with venomous glee beneath the cover of the applause. "Look at this, Julian. Every major financial network is carrying this live. That pathetic, middle-class assistant you used to call a wife is probably sitting in some drab, cheap apartment watching us take our rightful place at the top of the world. We got rid of her just in time." Julian let out a smug, quiet chuckle. "You were right, Chloe. Elena was good for filling out environmental permits, but she simply lacked the international caliber required for a stage like this. The asset waiver she signed is completely ironclad. She's completely out of the equation." Just as Julian stepped back to allow the lead investor from Dubai to sign the symbolic golden cornerstone document on stage, his phone began to vibrate violently in his pocket. He glanced down, his brow furrowing as he saw the name flashing on the screen. It was Harrison, the head of their massive on-site construction crew up on the Maine coastline. Julian clicked the ignore button without a second thought, shoving the device back into his pocket. This was his moment of absolute triumph. He wasn't going to let a frantic project manager or a minor labor issue interrupt his entry into the global elite. He didn't check his priority corporate inbox. He didn't see the urgent, high-priority alert that had reached his corporate legal department at exactly 1:45 p.m. from the State Land Registry office. He truly believed Elena was powerless, completely blind to the fact that the clock on the automated land use revocation she had triggered was down to its final 60 seconds. While Julian and Chloe stood beneath the flashing media lights at Central Park, basking in the applause of the international press, Elena sat in a quiet, glass-walled conference room on the fourth floor of a private maritime terminal in Portland, Maine. The space was stark, minimalist, and cool, illuminated by the steady blue glow of 3 ultra-wide external monitors tracking the construction coordinates of the coastal site. Outside her window, the gray Atlantic waters surged against the stone harbor, a sharp contrast to the manufactured glamour of New York. Elena's fingers moved across her slim laptop keyboard with unhurried precision. On her left monitor, a live digital stream showed the public media broadcast from the Central Park Pavilion, photographs of Chloe smiling radiantly, flanked by Julian and the executive board of the Dubai Sovereign Wealth Fund. They looked powerful, wealthy, and entirely untouchable. On her right monitor, a completely different narrative was unfolding. It was the master administrative dashboard for the Vance Coastal Land Preservation Trust. A flashing crimson notification indicated that the 72-hour grace period embedded within the Pendleton Provisional Land Use Permit had officially hit zero. Julian's high-priced corporate attorneys had completely ignored the formal, automated warning notice sent to their registered agent at dawn, likely dismissing it as a weak, post-divorce bluff from an emotional ex-wife. They had severely miscalculated. Elena didn't need to fight Julian in an ugly, multi-year divorce court to strip him of his wealth. She didn't need to leak family secrets to the tabloids. She owned the ground beneath his feet. "You really should have audited the property lines, Julian," Elena murmured into the quiet room, her expression completely serene. When Elena originally structured the surface access lease for the Oasis Initiative 4 years ago, she didn't just sign a standard real estate contract, she built a legal fortress. She knew the Pendleton family's defining flaw was their blinding, narcissistic arrogance. They took credit for every grand structure, but understood nothing about the underlying asset titles that supported them. Because of this, she had quietly embedded an absolute executive retention clause into the deed restrictions. The moment the Pendleton board voted to terminate her position as chief operating officer, they automatically triggered a material breach of the property covenant, rendering their entire multi-million-dollar construction site an illegal trespass. Elena moved her mouse cursor over to a prominent, glowing command icon on her dashboard labeled, "Enforce Land Trust Sovereignty and Issue Cease and Desist." She did not hesitate, she pressed the button. Instantly, the scrolling lines of blue data on her screen ceased, replaced by a cold, clinical string of text that blinked in a slow, rhythmic pattern. Lease status revoked. Property access denied. Federal injunction transmitted to on-site marshals. Elena leaned back in her ergonomic chair, picking up her cup of warm black tea. She took a slow, deliberate sip, her gaze fixed entirely on the live video feed of the press gala on her left monitor. The structural floor had been pulled out silently from a quiet office in Maine, and the devastating ripple effect was traveling straight down the East Coast at the speed of light, headed directly for the grand media stage in New York. Inside the private VIP tent at the Central Park Pavilion, Julian stood at the head of the polished glass signing table, his heavy gold fountain pen hovering exactly an inch above the multi-billion-dollar sovereign funding agreement. He looked directly at the chief executive of the Dubai Sovereign Wealth Fund, flashing his most charismatic, media-trained smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, when you invest in the Oasis Initiative, you aren't just funding real estate, you are funding a global paradigm shift in luxury. This project is the crown jewel of the Pendleton dynasty." The international board members and international banking executives nodded in deep admiration, their own pens ready to sign the counterpart funding documents. Chloe stood near the silk-draped entrance, her heavy diamond bracelets clinking softly as she sipped champagne, her face radiating the smug victory of a princess who had successfully purged an outsider from her kingdom. She cued the massive interactive video wall behind the stage to transition from the 3D renderings to a live, high-definition satellite feed of the construction site on the Maine coast, wanting the investors to see the active fleet of bulldozers breaking ground in real time. "And now," Julian announced, his voice booming with absolute authority, "let's look at the actual physical foundation of your investment." Chloe initialized the live master site stream. Chloe pressed the button on her remote. She expected the massive screen to instantly illuminate with the bustling activity of hundreds of construction workers, demonstrating the flawless, rapid operational velocity of the Pendleton brand. Instead, the live feed froze. The digital interface flickered violently once, twice, and then vanished into a pitch-black screen. A sudden, piercing error tone echoed through the high-end sound system of the pavilion. The sleek corporate presentation graphics disappeared, replaced by a cold, clinical string of bright red text that began to blink in a slow, terrifying rhythm. "Critical operational error. Access denied. Trespass warning issued. Site recovery prohibited by Land Trust Authority." A sharp, confused murmur instantly rippled through the panel of international banking executives. The warm smiles on the faces of the foreign investors vanished, replaced by narrowed eyes and immediate, defensive posture. Julian's breath caught sharply in his throat. His finger mashed the remote control repeatedly, but the black display remained stubbornly locked. Just a minor satellite synchronization delay with our East Coast coastal servers, Julian stammered into the room, a forced, hollow laugh escaping his lips as a sudden wave of cold sweat broke out across his forehead. Give our technical team 10 seconds to verify the pipeline. He stepped away from the table, his face turning a deep, angry red as he frantically gestured to his chief financial officer, who had just burst through the double doors of the tent. The CFO's face was completely pale, his hands shaking as he held a printed legal notice. Julian grabbed him by the arm, his voice a furious whisper. What the hell is going on with the mainstream? The Dubai board is sitting right inside that room. Julian, it's an absolute catastrophe. The CFO whispered frantically, his voice cracking under immense panic. The satellite didn't glitch. Our servers are perfectly fine. But the entire 600-acre coastal site in Maine has just been locked down by federal marshals. Every single bulldozer has been ordered to engine stop, and our construction crew is being escorted off the property for criminal trespass. That's impossible, Julian hissed, his grip tightening. The Pendleton conglomerate has spent $300 million building on that site. Nobody has the authority to evict my crew. They didn't need an eviction notice from a standard court, the CFO groaned, trembling as he pulled up the property deed on his tablet. The land registry just released an automated enforcement order. Julian, the Pendleton conglomerate doesn't own that soil. The underlying 600 acres is held entirely by a private entity called the Vance Coastal Land Preservation Trust. Our access was tied to a provisional COO retention covenant. The moment we terminated Elena yesterday afternoon, we legally triggered an immediate lease expiration. We are trespassing on her family's trust land. Julian stared at the screen, his mind spinning into absolute chaos as the name registered with devastating clarity. Vance Coastal Land Preservation Trust. Elena. Before he could even breathe, a sudden chime echoed from his phone. A text message from an unverified, encrypted number flashed on the glass screen. Enjoy your luxury blueprints, Julian. It's the last time you'll ever sell a horizon that doesn't belong to you. See you in the restructuring room tomorrow morning. Julian's hand lost all its strength, the phone slipping from his fingers and clattering loudly against the carpeted stage. He looked through the glass doors of the VIP tent, where the international investors were already standing up, their executive assistants frantically packing away their leather folders as news of the federal construction shutdown began to trend across the financial tickers. Chloe was rushing toward him, her face twisted in absolute horror. The brilliant trillion-dollar empire they had stolen from a quiet manager was disintegrating in real time, and Julian was standing completely exposed in the middle of the wreckage. The conference room on the 42nd floor of the Manhattan Commercial Arbitration Center was suffocatingly cold. Outside, the afternoon fog hung low over the East River, completely obscuring the city's skyline in a dense blanket of gray. Inside, Julian sat on the left side of the long glass table, flanked by his sister, Chloe, and his senior corporate attorney, Richard Vance. Julian looked completely unrecognizable from the self-made titan who had stood beneath the flashing media lights of Central Park just 24 hours prior. His tailored suit was wrinkled, his tie was loose, and his bloodshot eyes stared blankly at the tabletop. Following the catastrophic construction shutdown in Maine, the Pendleton Development conglomerate's stock had plummeted by 40% in morning trading. The Dubai Sovereign Wealth Fund hadn't just paused the contract, they had filed an international fraud notice to claw back their initial development fees and sue for reputational damages. Yet, Despite the smoke rising from his destroyed dynasty, Julian forced a desperate, defensive glare onto his face as the heavy glass doors at the back of the room swung open. Alina walked in. She wore an immaculate, charcoal gray tailored suit that radiated an unshakable, quiet authority. Her dark hair was styled into a sharp, professional bob, and her expression was entirely calm, completely devoid of the executive exhaustion that had defined her for 4 years. Behind her walked Marcus Vance, the most feared white-collar litigator in Manhattan, carrying a slim leather folder. Julian's lawyer, Richard Vance, looked up from his notes. His eyes instantly narrowed, his posture stiffening in sudden, deep unease as he recognized the powerhouse attorney representing the discarded COO. Richard stood up slowly, clearing his throat. "Marcus, what is the meaning of this?" "This is a private, low-level corporate debt resolution meeting. You don't handle standard marital asset dissolutions or employment disputes." "I don't," Marcus said smoothly, taking a seat next to Alina and opening his leather folder with precise, measured movements. "But I do represent the Vance Coastal Land Preservation Trust, which happens to be the primary property owner and sole landlord of the entire Oasis Initiative site. We are here today to finalize the absolute asset liquidation and enforce the terms of the eviction default." Chloe let out a sharp, bitter laugh, leaning forward over the table. She desperately needed to reclaim her sense of control. "Let's stop the theatrics, Elena. I don't know what kind of legal loophole you pulled with the coastal deeds, but our corporate lawyers are already working to bypass your environmental trust. It's only a matter of time before the state grants us an eminent domain override. Your standard corporate severance check is right here. Sign the absolute waiver, pack your things, and let's end this circus permanently." Elena didn't even glance at the check. She looked directly into Julian's eyes, her gaze entirely cold. "The papers are already signed, Chloe. I signed them in your boardroom at the Obsidian Tower. Today is simply about enforcing the exact terms that you and your brother insisted upon." The commercial arbitration referee presiding over the case entered the room, calling the session to order with a sharp tap of his pen. Before this panel authorizes an emergency injunction stay, the law requires the respondent's counsel to read aloud the finalized land covenants, specifically taking into account the verified ownership of the underlying property metadata. Richard Vance pulled the final document package toward him. He adjusted his glasses, completely confident that the prenuptial agreement he had drafted years ago would protect the Pendleton family's assets and leave Elena with nothing. He flipped to the addendum pages, his mouth opening to speak. "Your Honor, according to the standard prenuptial terms executed by both parties, all corporate equity, intellectual property, and developmental infrastructure under the name Julian Pendleton remain strictly." Suddenly, the words caught violently in his throat. Richard's eyes widened behind his lenses, scanning the fine print of the tech registration and land trust documents attached to the file. The color drained from his face so quickly it looked as if he had stopped breathing. His hands began to tremble, the thick parchment paper rattling loudly against the surface of the glass table. "Richard?" Chloe frowned, her sharp voice cutting through the room with intense impatience. "What is wrong with you? Read the clause. Remind her that she leaves with nothing." I can't," Richard whispered, a bead of cold sweat dripping down his temple. "Read it, counselor," the referee commanded, his voice echoing authoritatively in the silent room. Richard swallowed hard, his voice cracking under the weight of the text. Appendix M, Section 9. In the event of an executive termination initiated by the Pendleton Council against the COO, Elena Vance, the underlying land lease is hereby fully audited. The copyright of the civil master plans and the absolute title of the 600 coastal acres are held entirely by the Vance Coastal Land Preservation Trust. Furthermore, he stopped, looking up at Julian with pure horror. "Keep reading," Julian shouted, slamming his hand onto the table, an icy wave of panic violently seizing his chest. Furthermore, since the $300 million of structural infrastructure was installed under a provisional lease, the termination of said lease triggers an immediate default and forfeiture. 100% of the concrete foundations, deep-water utility networks, and architectural works currently on site are hereby reverted immediately to the landowner, Elena Vance, as liquid damages for material breach. The defendant walks away with zero equity in the physical site. The arbitration room erupted into absolute chaos. "No, that's a lie. She's a nobody. She was just a middle-class manager," Chloe screamed, lunging across the glass table toward her former sister-in-law, her face contorted in rage, only for two burly security officers to instantly step forward and pin her firmly back into her chair. Julian's hand flew to his throat, his face twisting in silent, paralyzed shock as he stared at the woman he had dismissed as a plain assistant. Elena slowly stood up from her chair, looking down at the panicked, broken family who had tried to discard her in the dark. "You told me to read the corporate waiver word for word, Julian," Elena said, her voice dropping into a register of absolute victory that silenced the room. "You should have checked who actually owned the soil beneath your empire before you decided to call me a low-class outsider." The fallout from the corporate restructuring room was instantaneous and unmerciful. By 2 p.m. that afternoon, the news had completely shattered the international real estate world. Wall Street blogs, luxury travel outlets, and digital financial ticker boards across Manhattan flashed the exact same breaking headline: "The Pendleton Empire collapses. Tech-driven eco-resort seized as ousted CEO reclaims absolute land sovereignty." Julian stood in the lobby of the Pendleton Development Conglomerate's grand headquarters in the Obsidian Tower, staring blankly at the two armed security guards who blocked his path to the private executive elevators. In his hands, he held a flimsy cardboard box filled with his personal desk items, a gold-plated mountain pen set, a few framed photos of his luxury yacht trips, and a stack of revoked corporate credentials. His executive security badge had been cleanly snapped in half at the front reception desk. "You can't do this," Julian yelled, his voice cracking with desperation as he glared at the building's supervisor. "I am the CEO. I am Julian Pendleton. My family built this tower from the ground up. This is my project." "Not anymore, Mr. Pendleton," the supervisor replied coldly, his tone entirely devoid of the sycophantic warmth Julian had grown accustomed to over the past 4 years. "We received an official corporate directive from the Vance Coastal Land Preservation Trust on behalf of the new majority structural asset owner. Your access to the design suites, the archives, and the development databases has been permanently terminated. You have 24 hours to vacate the corporate-owned penthouse as well, as it is a luxury asset cross-collateralized under the project's umbrella." Before Julian could process the massive blow, his phone vibrated violently in his pocket. It was the lead managing director from the Dubai Sovereign Wealth Fund calling from the East Coast Bureau. Julian answered frantically, pressing the phone to his ear with a shaking hand. "Hello? Hello, listen to me, the lawyers are sorting out the zoning anomaly right now." "Save your breath, Julian," the director's voice cut through the line, cold, transactional, and absolute. "The $1 trillion investment deal is officially dead. Our compliance team just finished reviewing the audited title filings from the Federal Restructuring Court. The sovereign fund will not allow its capital, its reputation, or its brand to be associated with a family that has been legally exposed for multi-million-dollar developer misrepresentation and stripped of their own construction soil overnight." "What about the marketing rollout?" Julian stammered, looking around the bustling lobby as corporate workers began to whisper and point at him from the glass mezzanine. "Chloe knows that we are the face of this." Chloe is currently finalizing her calendar to settle the outstanding media debts with our production agencies. The director interrupted ruthlessly. Don't contact our board again. You're a structural liability, Julian. And in this industry, we liquidate liabilities. The line went dead with a sharp, definitive click. Julian slowly lowered the phone, his hands shaking so violently that a heavy glass Architectural Achievement Award slid out of his cardboard box and shattered against the polished marble floor. At the exact same moment, a notification popped up on his screen from his private bank. Account status alert: primary personal and business credit lines frozen due to ongoing institutional asset repossession and default acceleration. Every single domino he and Chloe had meticulously set up the multi-billion-dollar valuation, the elite international connections, the absolute high society standing had fallen in a matter of hours. The very legal and corporate systems they had used to crush Elena had turned their massive, cold gears and crushed him instead. He was no longer a real estate titan looking down on the world. He was just a man standing in a lobby, holding a box of paper trash, with the freezing rain rushing in every time the glass doors slid open. The wind outside the Obsidian Tower was relentless, sweeping through the concrete canyons of Manhattan and carrying with it the bitter chill of a sudden winter storm. On the wet concrete sidewalk, a scene was unfolding that drew the immediate, hushed stares of hurried analysts, real estate litigators, and onlookers. Chloe stood huddled near the revolving glass entrance, her expensive mink coat offering absolutely no protection against the biting cold. Her face, usually a mask of aristocratic perfection and unyielding snobbery, was flushed with a mixture of panic and deep, raw humiliation. When the heavy security doors opened and Elena stepped out, flanked by Marcus Vance and her newly appointed corporate security detail, Chloe rushed forward, completely abandoning every shred of the high society dignity she had spent a lifetime cultivating. "Elena, please, stop," Chloe cried out, her voice cracking as she reached out a gloved hand, only to be politely but firmly blocked by Elena's lead security guard. "You have to listen to me. This has gone too far. Julian is completely ruined. They are repossessing the penthouse. His name is permanently blacklisted across the entire venture capital network, and the creditors are calling it every single corporate loan. You were a part of this family once, Elena. You can't do this to him. You can't do this to our family." Elena stopped. She turned slowly, her expression completely unreadable behind her dark designer sunglasses. She looked down at Chloe, whose eyes were wide with desperation, tears threatening to ruin her meticulously applied makeup. "Your family, Chloe?" Elena asked, her voice calm, slicing through the howling wind like a razor. "A day ago, you sat across from me in the boardroom and told me I lacked the caliber to even represent the Pendleton status. You stood by and cheered while your brother tried to throw me out of our own project with nothing but a standard severance check and 4 years of exhausting executive labor you called a middle-class bottleneck. Where was your sense of a family then?" "We were wrong," Chloe pleaded, her hands trembling violently as she looked past Elena toward Marcus Vance, hoping for a shred of legal leniency or pity. "We didn't know. We didn't understand your true capacity. If you just drop the immediate lease forfeiture clause, we can settle this quietly. We can fix this, Elena. We can restructure the infrastructure equity." "You still don't get it," Elena said softly, stepping closer so only Chloe could hear her next words over the roar of the city traffic. "You're not sorry you treated me like an outsider, Chloe. You're just sorry you got caught. You only value me now because you finally know what my soil is worth on a corporate balance sheet. That isn't respect. That's just survival." From behind them, Julian approached the curb, his cardboard box of personal belongings tucked awkwardly under his arm. He looked completely hollowed out, his posture slouched, staring helplessly at the woman he had completely underestimated for 4 long years. He opened his mouth to speak, to beg, to offer an apology he had never intended to give until his entire stolen empire crumbled into absolute dust. But Elena didn't give him the chance. She didn't look back at him. She looked down at the street, where her personal vehicle sat idling near the rear bumper of a waiting, midnight black town car. Her assistant stepped forward, opening the passenger door for her. "Keep the severance money, Julian," Elena said, turning her back on them as she prepared to step inside the warm luxury of the car. "Consider it my relocation allowance for you and your sister. You have 24 hours to leave my infrastructure." Elena stepped into the vehicle. The door closed with a solid, heavy thud, sealing out the noise and the cold of the city. As the town car pulled away from the curb and merged into the afternoon traffic, Julian and Chloe were left standing on the freezing pavement, completely ignored by the passing crowds, left